Hello everyone. Welcome to Decoded by Christian. This is my very first video interview, and I'm super excited to have Daniel, CEO of VIA, with me here today. We're actually going back for almost 7 years. It was a pitch in the West Village in New York when I was still at BMW. Company grew a lot since then, so excited to learn more about it. So Daniel, if we can maybe start, and if you can introduce yourself and just what is VIA about, what is VIA doing, that would be great.
Great. Thanks very much, Christian. I'm honored to be your first interviewee. I'm sure there'll be many more. I'm Daniel Ramot, one of the co-founders and CEO of VIA. VIA is a company that is looking to reinvent public transportation and introduce technology into public transportation. It's a space that, when you look at it, you realize very little, both effort and money, is spent on technology. And we believe there's an opportunity to transform the way that public transit operates and public mobility more generally beyond just public transportation. So also school buses and paratransit and any other way in which people move together in a publicly funded system. We believe technology can play a very large role in expanding the importance and the scope of public transportation and making it more accessible to everyone.
That's great. And you raised a lot of money as well. Maybe you can talk a bit about who are your investors, how much you raised for the other startups in the room.
Yeah, so we have raised a little bit of money, I would say. If you'd asked me when we started, would I have believed that we'd raise, hundreds of millions of dollars? I would have told you that there's no way, and that if we did, we must be the startup that has raised in mobility the most money in the world. And of course, that's not been the case. But it turns out that when we first started, we could go back to the story, but we ended up launching our service as a direct-to-consumer service in New York, and then expanded to several other cities. And that was a very building these two-sided marketplaces was a very capital-intensive exercise that ended up requiring a lot more capital than we had envisioned. And that's been a big part of what we've worked on, is obviously try to raise this capital, grow the business, and expand around the world.
Yeah, and you need a lot of people to do so. So this magic question for, I think, every CEO or every business person in the world is, how do I convince other people of this crazy idea that's in my head, and then them going with me on this journey where they have probably better paid jobs and kind of a stable situation, and you kind of against all the odds need to onboard them to your startup. How do you do that? What's your maybe magic trick of getting all those smart people into VIA?
Yeah, I'd say, in the beginning, at least for us, it was really about convincing people we knew, either directly or maybe indirectly through one other person, to join us. And it's very personal, I think, in the beginning. In the beginning, people are, obviously, they're vetting your idea and they're trying to make sure that it makes sense. But for the most part, they're joining, I believe, because they, to some extent, believe in you, believe in that team, believe that it's worth, as you were saying, Christine, like, betting their future to some extent, or at least some number of months or years of their future on this new venture. And without a personal connection to them, I think in the beginning it's very hard to do. It's very hard to attract really excellent people in the beginning if they don't know you directly or indirectly. I think as you grow, to some extent that continues. It's just broader. So the first people you bring on, I think, are absolutely critical. And if you bring on the right people, and you create a good culture, and the people around you are very strong, they're going to pull in other strong people. Whether they know them or not, it becomes a bit less important, because the company, hopefully you've raised some money, you have some sort of brand and a presence, but when folks come to interview, they're always evaluating you as well, and they're looking at who else are they working with. And if the impression is that the team is very strong, that's going to attract strong people in return. So I think that's sort of one key piece. The other key piece, which I think we've had at VIA that's been helping us a lot, that's been very positive, is that which is one of the reasons that Oren, my co-founder, and I chose to do this, is that inherently I believe VIA has a mission. It's sort of intrinsic to what we do, that if we're successful, we will hopefully have a positive impact on society, on cities, on reducing congestion, expanding mobility to people who sort of are underserved, reducing emissions. And I think that intrinsic quality of the company and the mission, I think helped us a lot in attracting some very talented people who were willing to, as you say, maybe take a pay cut or at the very least take a risk to join this venture. I think that's, so having a mission that you can articulate that resonates with people, I think helps to pull in very strong people who would otherwise, maybe go to some of the safer, larger companies.
Yeah. And Via by nature and from the beginning was a global company, right? You have a technology office in Israel. You have more the business side of the business, in the beginning at least only in New York, and now obviously globally. And I think this is one of the probably hardest thing to do, in addition to building the business you're doing, is scaling this company over multiple geographies, over multiple languages. So maybe how do you think about that? Like, what are maybe the drivers for you? The team, of course, you described, but beyond that, what do you think makes us successful, or what makes it fail sometimes?
Yeah, I think it's a tough, it's a tough challenge, and it has been a tough challenge. As you said, from the very beginning, Oren, my co-founder, and I were separated. I was in New York, he was in Tel Aviv. And then we very quickly, once we got past the initial stage of sort of growing the business in New York and a couple of US cities, started expanding across the globe. Today, we're operating in more than 20 different countries, and have offices, sort of permanent offices in more than 10. I think, some obvious things. First of all, there's communication is a key. And I think there's a balance to find between letting each local office, if you will, have sort of a tremendous amount of autonomy and independence and the ability to take initiative and get things done on their own, while still kind of enforcing, I think, a culture. So I think you want the culture, you want to be able to show up in the Via office in Tokyo or in Sao Paulo or in Dubai and say, wow, this really feels like Via. I just feel like I walked into, obviously this is the Via office. I recognize it. I recognize the people to some extent. I recognize the way they interact. So you want to enforce, I think, the culture, but allow a great deal of independence to the team, and then make sure that everybody feels part of one global team together, and that the mission is aligned, and everybody knows that they're kind of marching towards the same goal, and that they're benefiting from the tools and the developments that are happening around the world, so nobody's reinventing the wheel. So I think it's, obviously, I don't know that we're striking this in a perfect way. I'm sure there are many things we can still improve, but that's, I think that those are some of the ideas that go into it. So tremendous amount of local autonomy, but a consistent culture and a real connection between all the offices. Sometimes those things are a little bit at odds, but making them work, finding the right balance for them, I think is what we strive for.
Yeah. But this is extremely interesting because your business is so local, right? You have agencies, partners locally, and they're all different, right? Whether you're in Berlin, where I'm born, or in New York, you have different agencies, you have different cultures, you have different partners. Everything is different, and different laws for sure. So you're in a regulated space often. So how, from a CEO level or from a management level, what do you think is the split or kind of the energy you have to spend on those hyper local issues, like a big demonstration strike in France versus kind of how can the company grow globally? How do you kind of cut the split between those two, if you can describe it? And I'm sure it kind of goes in waves, but I'm sure many CEOs ask themselves the same question.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's transportation in general, and certainly when you're dealing with public mobility and you're working together with the city or transit agency or a local operator, it's an extremely local business. Everything from the regulations to the way even people think about transportation, what they expect from it, the way the regulators think about it, obviously. I think that part, it makes it very difficult to scale the business globally. So you have to find a way, you have to sort of identify, okay, well, what does repeat? What is consistent across? In the end, we're all people. We all want to get around easily, conveniently, and affordably. And what is different between each different jurisdiction? And I think the key to me, at least for how I think about, you were asking sort of how I approach this, is on the one hand, I definitely like to be in the details and understand all of these local details, because I feel that without that, you're sort of, if you get into a conversation about it, you're advising in a vacuum. I don't know that what you're sort of suggesting, if you don't really grasp the details, is of that much value. On the other hand, you also have to know sort of where to step back and, as you say, focus on some of the more global issues, and also let the teams get the job done and feel like they have the independence to do what needs to be done, and then the ownership, and that's what drives sort of initiative and creativity, I think. So finding that balance is really the trick, and to some extent, it's really about, I think, understanding who needs your help and who doesn't need your help. So constantly evaluating whether you're actually being helpful by diving into the details or getting into that local region, and where you don't need to get involved. It's going very well. You're not going to be able to help very much, and sort of reserving that time to focus on some of the more global questions. That's the day-to-day challenge, I feel.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And it's a good bridge actually to the next side of what I wanted to talk with you about. COVID-19. It's extremely challenging, especially for this industry. It's everything that touches people, that is in the real world, not just in the digital world, is extremely under stress right now, and it's different from country to country. So to what we just talked about. So what is VIA's answer today to COVID? How are you coping with that? Are you extremely impacted, not so impacted? Can you maybe talk about what VIA and the COVID situation is today?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that this video that we're doing together, video interview, will stick around for a while, and people who watch it, some number of months, years from now, will look back and say, what was COVID? What was that thing, so far in the past? So, and I'm hoping that will be very soon, that it will be behind us very quickly. It is, obviously it has a tremendous impact on people in general and business, but certainly on transportation. It's not easy to be in the mobility business when people are sheltering at home, to say the least. I think, what we see is VIA has sort of two parts to our business. One, where we operate a service directly for consumers, I mentioned earlier, which is how we started in New York and several other cities. And that part of the business, simply because people are sheltering at home, and they're starting to come out now, but that's been the case for a good number of weeks, many places where we operate. That has had a tremendous impact on our business, especially since we focus on shared rides and people sharing a vehicle. And in some places that's been completely banned. In other places, we have decided to pause that in order to ensure that we are helping people stay healthy. So we've transitioned our services to private rides, where people aren't sharing their rides, but that's not really our core business. To some extent, that's much more what Uber and Lyft and those folks are doing. So that's had a pretty big impact on our business. I'd say quite similar to what Uber and Lyft have reported in their public statements recently. Sort of 80–85% declines are pretty common. So it's pretty big impact. The other side of our business, where we are partnering with cities and transit authorities and operators, public transit operators, and providing our software or operating on behalf of cities, effectively a dynamic on-demand public transportation system, there we've seen a lot less of an impact. People still need to get around, and we've been working with all the cities in which we operate, in particular, to help those folks who have to get around, who are essential workers, a lot of times health workers, people who work in anything from grocery stores to the food supply chains. So we've adapted many of our services together with the cities in which we operate to specifically support these types of health workers and other essential workers. In some cases, we've even gotten into deliveries. So again, supported by cities, deliveries of food and essential supplies to folks who can't leave their homes, whether they're elderly or otherwise in need. A lot of times kids who are otherwise going to school and getting their meals in school, they're getting breakfast and lunch in school, schools are closed. So we're working with cities to make sure that we're delivering anything from food to diapers, to families that are in need. And that's helped us a lot, both kind of stay busy to some extent. And I think our team is very excited about being able to truly help these cities around the world and maintain these relationships and maintain these services operating. So I'd say on that side of the business, the impact has been not zero, but a lot less. And we're also seeing a lot of opportunities in areas that we were never active before, such as deliveries, or there are quite a few new cities where we've been able to launch services as those cities have looked around the world and seen, for example, what we did in Berlin, what you mentioned earlier, where we took our existing public transit service and transformed it into a health worker late night sort of emergency service that's been very successful. Other places around the world, like Abu Dhabi and a number of other cities, have sort of done the same and actually launched new services using VS technology. So we're also seeing some opportunity to some extent in this crisis to support new cities that we weren't working with before.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. And just you listening to you talking about it, you immediately had examples from Berlin, Abu Dhabi, US. I mean, it's so fascinating because you're going back to what you said earlier. You're sharing the knowledge. You can apply this globally. It's fascinating. And I assume, I mean, you're always relying on those partners, and you will always rely also in the future on those partners. And now you're became in a way more reliable or more important, but this assumption more important in this crisis now to the transit agencies, to the operators. So do you think there is a long-term positive effect, or is this kind of, will this go away once this problem, so to say, is solved? You're kind of back to where you were before?
I think, I'd say just very, very transparently, in the short term, this year is not going to be as great as a year as we hoped. I think we were on a trajectory where we were growing extremely fast. I would say, we were probably signing up 2 to 3 new cities every week to use our services prior to COVID. And that growth is definitely going to be impacted because we can't get out there. It's affecting our pipeline. And I'm sure that's true for many, many software companies. It's much harder to go out and sort of pitch your services, explain what you do, create that we were just talking about that earlier, Christian, you and I, before this, create that personal connection with a city or a potential partner that we want to work with. So on the one hand, I think there's definitely going to be a short-term impact. In the long term, I'm actually much more bullish because, as you said, I think cities are realizing a few things. One, just related to us, those cities with whom we work, I think are realizing that we are good partners. I hope, looking at LA, for example, where we very, very quickly transitioned our service at their request, expanded the zone, began delivering meals and supplies. Again, everything that they've sort of asked us for. Fortunately, our technology has been sufficiently flexible and modular that we could very quickly adapt. In New Zealand, we had a service that was going to launch in a few months. They asked us to accelerate that and launch very quickly. This was also true in Washington State. So a number of different places where I think we've been able to demonstrate to the partner that we are good partners. But I think beyond that, and sort of as I mentioned, there's some new opportunities that we've been able to foster with cities that we hadn't previously worked with. But I think beyond that, there's a broader theme here, which is that it's very clear that cities that have a technology-enabled public transportation service were able to adapt to the crisis to some extent much better than cities that didn't. Cities that didn't had to rely on their existing bus networks, fixed route, very rigid, very difficult to adapt to a completely different demand picture that sort of has come up during COVID, versus cities that had this technology available to them or that were quickly able to launch it, were able to adapt much more rapidly and I think successfully to the demands of this crisis. And I think as we come out of it, there are going to be real questions about what does public transportation look like post this crisis. How are cities going to deal with what is likely to be, for an extended period of time, a very different picture of demand, of willingness to ride with other people? How do you do contract tracing on a bus? And so I think technology is actually a big part of how public transportation revives itself to some extent and adapts and is successful post this crisis. And so I hope that we are in a position to support cities that want to do that. And that while this crisis is certainly going to have a negative impact in the short term, in the long term, for anybody who's in the technology business and mobility, it could actually be a positive.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for that background. And maybe a more general question, and it could be based on VIA, it could be based on just generally how you see the industry or the world. So do you think, and we all hope this COVID-19 crisis is over as quickly as it came, or hopefully quicker, and nobody remembers that in a year. There are probably more signals right now that this will be quite a memorable event for everybody going forward. So I'm curious, do you think there's any profound impact that this crisis, this pandemic had, where humanity or business or startups or mobility will always be changed. And you talked about some, but maybe a little bit broader, more deeper change that you foresee now being true, that we had to experience this crisis.
I think any sort of projections at this point are probably very, very risky, given the world is so uncertain. So I'd say, to me, obviously very hard to know. And I think you're right, Chris. It will be a memorable event. That I'm hoping that it becomes sort of just a memorable event and not a continuing event very quickly. But I think that if we were to look back, we feel like this is a very, very unique event. But the reality is that, and it's been talked about quite a bit, is that humans have faced pandemics sort of fairly regularly every 50 to 100 years or so over quite a long period of time, sometimes more frequently, sometimes less frequently. And I think the reality is that after several years, we've generally gone back to things sort of as normal. So I don't know that human behavior in a sort of very fundamental way is going to change. You never know. Hopefully this crisis doesn't lead to even more severe social upheavals and other sort of really bad geopolitical consequences. But assuming that that is not the case, if I had to guess, I'd say we probably go back to something that resembles the previous normal. However, I suspect that there are certain trends that were already sort of underway that probably get accelerated, right? So it's not like e-learning or telemedicine or many of these things didn't exist. Or work from home, right, enabled by Zoom or any other technology wasn't happening. My guess is that they just get accelerated to some extent, because of this crisis. And I think the same, if I were to come back to sort of my narrow world in transportation, technology was being increasingly embedded into public transportation and mobility in general. My guess is this is just sort of accelerates it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's that's very true. I hope humanity can be better after this. That's for sure. And many of those digital trends certainly can help environment. And we have been seeing it clearly here in New York, not today, but the air quality and those things can be improved if we're reducing a bit of travel and unnecessary travel. So finding the right mix and balance between what we have to experience now and then when we can travel and when we can go from A to B freely again. That's at least my big hope here. So switching a little bit gears and to the end of this interview, we all believe in continuous learning, and we're all smarter every day than the last day. And so looking back in your younger self, let's say 10 years ago, things you didn't know, you wished that you know back then. And it doesn't need to be necessarily a specific business piece, but just something maybe packaged as a type of advice to CEOs, to people generally, where they're like, this is really the biggest learning you had and you're willing to share today.
Yeah, I want to go back and tell myself, don't do it. But that wouldn't be true. I think that starting a company from scratch is a super exciting, super challenging journey, and one that I think you never kind of quite know what you're getting into. And I think there are probably many learnings that have come out of it. I think some of the bigger ones are, and I've sort of something I always tell. Maybe the one piece of advice, I don't know that I'm in a position to give too much advice, but the one piece of advice when I talk to entrepreneurs is to move very, very quickly. I think there in the very beginning when Oren and I started, we had the idea for VIA. We knew we were very excited about it. And then we sort of took a year to do a lot of work around securing the initial funding, building a lot of sort of proof of concept simulations, and convincing ourselves of the financial model that it was really going to work. And we felt that we were doing that because in doing that, we were really reducing our risk because we were, if we're going to quit our jobs, we were going to have some money lined up, and we would already sort of done the business case in a lot of detail and talked to a very large number of people from the industry, interviewed a lot of potential customers, right? We were sort of setting ourselves up for success, and we invested a year in really reducing our risk across many different dimensions. I think the one dimension where we didn't quite realize we were not reducing the risk, we were actually increasing our risk quite a lot, is by taking that year and delaying everything that we were doing. So to me, and of course you've got to find the balance. You don't just want to quit your job and jump at the first idea that comes your way. But I think you usually have a good intuition for what is a really great concept that you really believe in and what isn't. And my advice would be, once you find it, go for it. You know, I think the time is another risk element that you tend to underestimate, and in cleaning up all the other sort of risk factors, you exacerbate that one. So I think just that would be one thing that I would say is, especially in the beginning, if you're confident about your idea, move very quickly, go to execution as fast as you can. Don't spend too much time doing market research and so forth, which people generally feel a real need to do. That would probably be my one big piece of advice. I think the other that is much smaller that I've sort of seen throughout the last few years is this idea that sometimes you'll tend to take a decision that you think is, yeah, you know, I call this the no good deed goes unpunished sort of category, where, you know, you try to do something, whether it's for a partner or you don't take the hard decision. You know, whether it's an employee who you have who you don't think is a fit anymore, or a partnership that isn't working, and you just you try to do the right thing to some extent, or the good thing by keeping that going. And when it's not right for the other person as well. And just delaying that hard decision, I think, and this is especially true a lot of times during we're seeing this during this crisis, right? There are a lot of very hard decisions that I think business leaders around the world have to take. And taking those decisions early rather than trying to be sort of supportive in some way where that's not the right thing, I think just comes back to bite you down the road.
Perfect ending. Thank you so much, Daniel. This was super exciting, super interesting. I learned a lot. I hope it's interesting for whoever views this in the future as well. And hope to see you soon again. Stay safe, and thanks for coming.
Thanks very much, Christian. It was a real pleasure, and I hope to see you in person very, very soon.